For the last almost 15 years now, we have taken the 4 weeks leading up to Advent to talk about 4 saints from the Christian tradition. And we do this, we tell their stories to kind of pay attention to how they were faithful in their time, to see if we can learn more about how to be faithful in our own time. And our only requirements are they have to exemplify a life of compelling faithfulness, and they have to be dead. We don't want anybody messing it up like an end game. We're going to make sure they finish the race. And we often choose saints who have been important to Redemption Church the same year that they have died, and that is the case this year. We've done that in the past with like Beegner and Eugene Peterson. And our saint for today died this last summer. It's a man by the name of Walter Brueggemann, who's a big one for me. A renowned Old Testament scholar who's had a profound impact on my life and the life of Redemption Church. He is perhaps the greatest biblical scholar of our time. He wrote 120 books, 14 of which were published in the final 2 years of his life at age 90 and 91. Like, who has the energy at 90 and 91? In fact, he still has 2 or 3 more books currently in press right now. It's likely that at some point his death will start to diminish his publishing, but I don't know when that will be. It's not right now. He was a force of nature who changed biblical scholarship and breathed life into churches like Redemption. I first met Walter in seminary, although technically he was not there at the time, because I first met him, as many did, through his book, The Prophetic Imagination. Anybody read Prophetic Imagination? Yeah, it's a wonderful book. It's a rare breed. It's a theology book that sold 1 million copies. Like, who does that? And after reading it, I'm sure, along with thousands of others, became sort of a non-degree seeking student at Brueggemann University. And more than anything else there, I found that Walter Brueggemann really loved his students. Eventually, we did meet. This is one of my most proud pictures right there. Look how bad I'm cheesing in this picture. I'm probably shaking like I met a rock star. We often corresponded over the last 10 years, and he was incredibly generous with his time. I mean, if he was talking to me, he was talking to thousands of people. We bonded over our love of theology and the church, and as fathers, we both were fathers of 2 boys. And I could just email him about stuff I was thinking or talking about and writing about, and he would get back to me usually with some kind of insight or wisdom to clarify my thinking, point me in the right direction, and always encouraged me in my work. He would every once in a while send a random email if he read something that I wrote that he liked. He was an early reader of my book, Shrink, and gave me important notes, and then wrote a blurb and helped spread the word about it. And he was just that kind of generous man. So Walter knew about Redemption Church and was quite proud to have had such a big influence on us. He especially loved our practice of reading the Old Testament all summer long. In fact, when we talked about it, he's like, I make that recommendation to everybody. I don't expect anybody to really follow it through. You guys might be the first ones who actually did it. And when we were studying Genesis the first time, he agreed to talk with me and let me record the conversation so we could put it out there. We will repost that this week in our podcast feed so you can listen to that. He said one time, I count KC as home because I grew up near Marshall, Missouri. So he felt kinship with Kansas City, although he was a lifelong Cardinals fan. You know, he was there before the Royals existed. In fact, he said that he always taught his boys 2 lessons that were, irrefutable. One is love Jesus. The other is hate the Cubs. So we have that in common. He was born in Tilden, Nebraska in 1933. Grew up all over the place, but a lot of time in Marshall, Missouri, where his father was a pastor. He went to Elmhurst College for his undergrad, did his seminary training at Eden Theological Seminary near St. Louis. He's very loyal to Eden because they had allowed his father to come study there even though he didn't have an undergraduate degree. And Walter was like, this is a good institution. He ended up giving 25 years of his life teaching and acting as academic dean there. But first, before that, he went to Union Theological Seminary for a THD, where his mentor was a guy named James Meilenberg. You might recognize Meilenberg was also one of Frederick Buechner's main influences. And Meilenberg was pioneering this new method of biblical scholarship called rhetorical criticism. And Brueggemann learned this from him and then became one of its most productive practitioners. And so today, I'm actually not going to give a lot of his biography, the story of his life. I want us to interact with his thoughts. So I'm just going to flood you with quotes from Brueggemann and things that he said and concepts. I want to get his words in front of us and his vision for the church. For probably the century or maybe two before Brueggemann began his work, Old Testament Studies was busy translating Old Testament theology into the language of modernity, to translate the God of the Bible into rational categories. So biblical studies was kind of like a science then, doing lots of biblical history, archaeology, trying to get the original meanings of all the texts. And they were really fixated on finding one unifying theme for all the Old Testament and one view of God, trying to harmonize all the different voices to have one univocal, consistent view of God. And Brueggemann thought this had totally domesticated the Bible and turned a living text into like an artifact in a museum. He said that the task of interpretation isn't to explain, it's to evoke an alternative world that liberates the human imagination from their bondage to the empires of the world. And he said it's almost like Israel is at the bar in a courtroom, giving testimony about their encounters with this wild and strange God of the Bible. And the Bible's the record of their testimony. But the witnesses don't agree. They have deep disagreements about who God is and what God's like. And so their testimony can't be read like objective data. It's passionate storytelling and poetry, and it's partisan. They're arguing from their personal experience. So the texts are confessional and passionate arguments and not objective proofs. And he saw his job as a scholar as sort of lawyer for the defense, to make sure every witness gets a hearing on their own terms, not trying to harmonize, not trying to protect God's reputation. Just let every voice speak and pay a close attention to what's actually said by the people about God, by God to the people, by the people back to God. Just let the witnesses speak. And if we do this, what we'll notice is that the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is a big argument over who God is and what God's doing. And Brueggemann said, this is by design. Because true understanding and insight will only come for humanity when we bump it into these kind of unsolvable contradictions, these deadlocks or an impasse. That's the only time we get desperate enough to be open to a new insight from God. God speaks, he said, from within dispute to bring a new imagination about life in the world and what it means to be human. And so we shouldn't try to solve the tension. We just got to listen and let crash these things into one another and let that energy of their argument and the fatigue at finding no easy answers sort of open us up to new ideas that we might otherwise resist. He said that crisis is the very nature of Christian and Jewish history. And so he began to describe the Old Testament as testimony and counter-testimony. Testimony came from the priests. They said that God was always just and good. If you obey God, God will bless you and things will work out. If you don't obey God, God won't bless you and things won't work out. And then the counter-testimony came from the prophets who said that is not at all how things happen in the world. The worst kinds of people who don't obey God, who are violent and greedy and brutalize the vulnerable and corrupt the systems and abuse their power, they're the ones who get blessed. And so there's this fight, this deep disjunction, he loved that word, disjunction, at the heart of the Old Testament. It's one of his big insights that the Old Testament is this argument between the priestly and prophetic traditions about this God who refused to settle the argument or silence either side, and who instead used that, sustained the argument, made it worse to try and give the people of God a new imagination. And Brueggemann sort of took this one step further to say that the reason for this is that God's own life exists in deep disjunction. He said the Old Testament doesn't talk about a far-off God of doctrines and principles who's out there somewhere else. It talks about a God in the fray, involved in the world, within our arguments and conflicts, in the messes of our ethical, moral, relational problems, and our politics, and war and peace, and hopes and dreams and fears and failures. He said this is where God appears and reveals God's self to humanity. And so this means that the God of the Bible runs toward trouble to inhabit the arguments and contradictions. And even including those things, the disjunction within God's own life. I seriously think in 100 years, if they're still talking about Brueggemann, this is one of the things they'll note that was important. There's a disjunction within the very life of God, because love itself is disjunction. Love is an ache, a longing. And this longing is the point of contact between humanity and God. In a sense, we are the disjunction within God's life. God's life includes disjunction because God lives in radical solidarity with humanity. So even our brokenness is brought into God's life. In essence, God suffers everything we suffer, but doesn't leave us alone in bondage. God is in the business of liberation, setting us free to be human as human was intended to be. And so because of this, as an Old Testament scholar, Brueggemann wasn't like involved in all the just boring debates. He wanted the Bible to speak to our neighborhood, our world. He didn't want us to so much read the Bible as he wanted the Bible to read us and read our world, to question our lives and our politics, our economics, our systems and institutions. And when he talked about the Bible, he always talked about America. And he would always say some version of, we have been seduced into following a false narrative that makes huge promises to us about safety and security and meaningfulness and happiness. And it promises if we'll play ball and just go along with culture, we'll be safe and secure and happy and have a meaningful life. And he was one of the early voices saying this will never work. And he would describe this narrative we're sold in many ways, but it always came down to empire. He would often describe empire with the word totalism. He loved this word. Totalism is any system of power that claims to be absolute and self-sufficient, whether it's economic or political or religious or cultural. A totalism promises to provide everything you need for flourishing in life through its own systems of empire. Everything from food and housing to water and sewage and healthcare to meaningless to love to safety, security. The totalism promises to provide everything we need for life. It's comprehensive, covers every aspect of life. And so the idea that anything good or necessary could come from outside the system just seems unimaginable to those within the totalism. All of life is contained within the system. And our job is to just trust the totalism. Support the system and we'll be fine. That's the promise. And he taught that the biblical archetype for this, for empire, is Pharaoh and Egypt. And he would just say all the time that the American narrative is basically a replica of Pharaoh and Egypt. But the problem is from within the totalism, we're sort of blind to this reality. And so God's trying to get us to wake up and to join in an exodus from empire, liberation. Because what empire does to us is not good. I mean, what empire essentially does is reduce everything to a commodity with a value that can be traded or assigned, and then they design their systems like Egypt as a pyramid, shuffling all the value up the pyramid so that those at the top can live extravagant lives while those at the bottom just bear all the weight of the system, but don't share in the same blessings as those at the top. They do the building, the fixing, the labor, the servicing, the caring. They provide all the energy for the system, but the blessings flow up the pyramid. And then when the people have the, gall, the temerity to complain about the injustice to those at the top, what Pharaoh says is, I'm going to do a Brueggemann imitation here because he had the greatest voice. He would say, lazy, lazy, lazy. You're lazy. That's what Pharaoh always says. Lazy, lazy. You're at the bottom and need public assistance because you're lazy. You're a burden on the system, even though, of course, it's those at the top who don't work but get all the wealth. They're the burden. And the Exodus, he said, is about God leading the children of Israel out of the totalism. And where he led them to was into the wilderness, where they thought they were going to die. Because when you leave the totalism, it feels like you're going to die. But what they found instead was manna each day, bread to eat, and quail that would just fly into camp so they could cook them and eat them, and water that flowed from rocks, and God leading through this pillar of cloud and fire, and God's presence at the center of their camp. It turns out everything they needed to live was provided for them right there in the wilderness. Even though they'd been led to believe you couldn't survive out there unless Pharaoh was sending supplies. And so in the Exodus, they learned that the moment we actually step outside the totalism, God shows up and provides for life. And so the wilderness is sort of this paradigm for liberation. Then in the New Testament, Jesus re-performs that wilderness story when he feeds the 5,000 and 4,000 that we read earlier. This happens in the wilderness. This is on purpose. And not only are they fed, there's tons of surplus. 12 baskets full and 7 baskets full. 7 means enough. 12 means people of God. It's always enough for the people of God. This is what the church held on to, that if you leave the totalism and then stay close to Jesus, there's always plenty of bread. We don't know how. It's kind of unexplainable, but it's true. And Brueggemann was convinced that the American totalism was crumbling. He could see this clear back in the 1970s. Because no empire can make good on its promises. And he could see in recent years, the failures have become too obvious to ignore. The damage it does to the vulnerable, to the environment, to our systems, in the form of war and poverty and injustice, addiction, loss of economic viability and meaning. It's eventually becomes obvious to everyone the script isn't working. We're living Pharaoh's failed script. And Brueggemann believed that the only people living within the totalism who have been equipped with a better story are the people of God. The problem is, just like with Moses, just like, at least to some extent in the days of Christ, the church has been seduced by the promises of empire. He said, the contemporary American church is so largely enculturated to the American ethos of consumerism that it has little power to believe or act. They bought into Pharaoh's economy. At the same time, then all the biblical scholars were just consumed with, inside baseball doctrines and theologies. And so all of Christianity in America was sort of left blind to the key issue, which for Brueggemann was always the economy of Pharaoh and empire and the totalism and the damage it does to people who live in bondage to it. He gave this interview one time where he said, I'm much more interested in the economy than I am questions of atonement, which everybody loves to fight about in the Old Testament. And the interview said, why is that? And he said, well, I study the Old Testament. That's why. And the Old Testament is essentially a book about economics. The issue, he said, is not really socialism or capitalism. He's speaking right to the issues of our day. The issue is, how do we organize the economy to act out of the deep truth of neighborliness? Neighboring was a huge theme for him. It's almost synonymous with Christianity. For Brueggemann, the fundamental conflict that defines ours and every era is between empire and neighboring, and which story will define us. What it means to be the people of God, he said, is to choose neighboring over empire, to trust relationships, to teach us who we are and keep us secure and lead us to meaning and purpose. And he said that the Bible's claim is that the good life can never be provided by empire, by totalisms. It's a gift from God that comes through neighboring. He said this God has bet everything on relationships. And this God intends us to bet everything on relationships. Whether it's persons or neighbors or communities or nation states, entire cultures. God's plan for our security isn't power or technology or armies or governments or therapies or anything that exists within the totalism. The only path to security comes through neighbors who care for each other. The only path to meaningfulness comes through fidelity and self-sacrifice with our neighbors. He says, we cannot secure ourselves. We can only be secured by someone who is faithful to us. He thought that the fundamental conflict of our time is between empire and neighboring. And God's bet everything on neighboring. The problem is, in our time, for Brueggemann, he was convinced, the church has bet everything on empire, seeking the favor of Pharaoh, gaining power through the system. He said this is why the church is in turmoil. And because the church has the narrative, the alternative narrative, this is why the society's in turmoil for him. He said the Bible has been treated in distorted ways as a legitimator of that destructive ideology. So we have to have an argument about that. That's what he thought. We have to follow the lead of the Old Testament witnesses and fight it out. You know, the church is so fully captured, he thought, that actually trying to disengage from empire and the totalism gets you called a socialist or a heretic these days. That's how captured we are. All the while, what the empire does is make everything really convenient for those who just cling to its promises and go with the flow. Now, this is the chief commodity of empire for Brueggemann. It's not like justice or mercy or fidelity or even meaning or affluence. The biggest commodity of empire is convenience. Just go with the flow and get all the goodies. And so disengaging from that is very inconvenient. He used to say this all the time. I heard him say it at least half a dozen times. Most of us do not mind dying for Christ, but what we do not want to do is be inconvenienced. He was convinced that the future of the people of God depends on growing our capacity for inconvenience, reclaiming our ability to just relinquish the failed script of empire and embrace the biblical script of neighboring. Or in theological terms, neighboring is covenanting. Same thing. In his book, The Prophetic Imagination, and also in the 19 Theses that we talked about last month, he kind of spells out how to do this using the archetype of the Old Testament prophets. He wanted us to reclaim what he called our prophetic imagination. And I kind of do, when I teach this, I do a mashup of that book, The Prophetic Imagination, and the 19 Theses, and I describe it this way. The task of the church in our time for Brueggemann is to relinquish the failed script, to articulate an alternative script, and then to energize a new neighborhood toward hope. That first movement is rooted, he said, in lament, actually. It's kind of counterintuitive. Lament means to bring to speech the failure of that old script, to critique it, just by looking around and seeing what's getting jacked up in our world. Brueggemann really believed that we need prophetic churches who know how to lament. It's the native tongue of the prophets. Honestly, we really see ourselves at Redemption Church as part of that prophetic tradition. Not in like the, TV prophet, hucksters trying to tell your future and sell you little tchotchkes or whatever. We actually learn from Brueggemann, the prophet's job is not actually to tell the future. The prophet's job is to tell the truth about the world right now. And then say, if we keep doing this, this is where it's going. That's where the future part comes in. And if we don't change direction and alliance, we're cooked. And so there's this grief to it. In fact, he said, the prophets are not so much angry as they are sad. And they're sad because they see where this is going. Prophets aren't future tellers, they're truth tellers, bringing to speech the injustice and the suffering under empire. And we begin to relinquish that failed script of empire through faithful lament. He said, lament is the breaking of numbness by the admission of pain and loss. And if we don't stay close to our pain, he said, then we cannot stay close to our neighbor's pain. So lament is actually part of how we learn neighboring. I guess as you've all experienced this in your life. The next movement then is to articulate an alternative script within the people of God. Brueggemann said the key point is really switching narratives. I think he said that's what the Bible means by conversion, to be converted to a more adequate narrative account of reality. This is the whole reason we worship, or at least a big part of it, to gather every week to lament, tell the truth about the world, but also to articulate a better script. This is so crucial. A better story of neighboring and covenanting that we find in the Bible. And Brueggemann's assertion that was over time, this actually can begin to transform our imagination. And don't even know really how it works. But the key is we can't get stuck in lament. We have to move to articulation of another narrative. The children of Israel, this was their mistake. They just got stuck in lament and about injustice and suffering. We have to also be captivated by a new narrative of liberation through neighboring. Brueggemann once said, the difference between the whiner and the prophet is the prophet has an alternative vision for the future. This is it. We can't just whine about the weakness of the old script. We have to learn a whole new script. And this is major surgery for those of us who live within the totalism. It takes years of storytelling and liturgy and study and recitation and community. And the goal is a prophetic imagination that can sort of like see the matrix, you know what I mean? And understand how we're being controlled and manipulated. So we're liberated to kind of imagine together in ad hoc ways a different way to be, a new way to organize. And this happens as we begin to experience what the children of Israel experienced way out there in the wilderness. That God just kind of shows up with this influx of energy from outside the totalism. And this energy, the life of God, is what sustains us and leads us to what Jesus called the eternal kind of life. Now, I feel this energy, honestly, I feel it every time we gather as a church. There's something different about this place. And I can't name it, but I feel it. This energy from God. Brueggemann says, when pain is brought to speech, it turns to energy. If it is not brought to speech, it turns to despair. So this is the difference between like the lament of the culture and the church. Because we're switching stories and enacting this new script, we have this new imagination for neighboring, a neighboring economy of sorts. Because of this, our lamenting does not turn to despair, it turns to energy to embody this new world God promises. And this energy is what it transforms us into a people of hope instead of despair. Well, we can still tell the truth about how jacked up our world is and where it's headed if we don't change, but we don't get stuck in despair because we have a different vision, imagination, and we are experiencing neighboring, and the energies of God then come, and we don't despair. And despair is a huge problem in our world. Brueggemann actually wrote about it a fair amount. He said one time, there are two kinds of people who despair. Those who have nothing and conclude they will never get anything, and those who have everything and who want to keep it just the way it is. Both find promises impossible. God makes promises. You got one group, taking all their power and energy to defend the totalism because it works for them, and the other wallowing in despair because it doesn't. But they have no idea what to do about it. And that's not us. Brueggemann said this is where the church lives, is in that tension. Because we have a different imagination, and we have the presence of God, which means energy and hope. And this is really the third movement of being liberated. It's to energize a new neighborhood toward hope. We can embody a new culture together. A common life, it's not determined by empire. It's actual spaces to be together where our lives aren't defined by the totalism. And just being in that space for a few hours a week can really begin to liberate us from bondage. It's just so deeply humanizing. And it unleashes this power, this energy in our lives. And we start to come alive with the life that's truly life, or what Jesus called being born again. And so a big part of the church's task is just to cultivate spaces where we can be together and not be determined by the totalism of empire, where it's just not the lens through which we see each other or the world. Spaces where we can relate as neighbors, not as competitors, where our value as a human being, it's not determined by how much we make or what kind of car we drive or how much we can produce and consume, but just by the fact that we're beloved children of God, where our relationships are more important than our achievements, And he was just convinced that the people of God are the only ones in the American totalism who are equipped for this task of liberation from empire. And he just spent his life writing, not so much for academics, but for the church. He said, my advocacy is simply that the biblical narrative is a more adequate narrative for the shaping of public reality and the living of our lives, because that narrative has as its key player the God of grace and justice and freedom and faithfulness. For the past 15 years, this vision has really defined so much of what we do at Redemption Church. To relinquish the failed script through faithful lament, tell the truth about a world and where it's headed best we can, and then to articulate an alternative script with the people of God, and to embody this in our common life, and then to just energize the neighborhood toward hope, laying down our lives for the life of the world. And honestly, I don't know if it would have ever happened without Walter Brueggemann. He's changed my life and the life of Redemption Church all the way to the bedrock. And I'm so grateful. Walter would often share this rabbinic story about the children of Israel leaving Egypt. It's a story the rabbis used to tell, that when Moses got to the Red Sea, God had parted the waters, but not all the way. There was still this little thin layer of water still there. And it was shallow, but it still covered the ground. And so Moses, when he got there, he had to put one foot into the water, and then the water parted, but only that far. And then he had to put another foot in the water, and then the water parted, but only that far. And the sea only ever parted as far as his feet had taken him. It's an old rabbinic narrative. Walter said, the requirement is you have to put your foot in the water, and then you are delivered that far. And putting our foot in the water is kind of another name for being part of a church. Taking the leap of faith together into this new world God imagines for us that God began in and through Christ. Remembering all the while what Walter once said, that the gospel is fiction when judged by the empire, but the empire is fiction when judged by the gospel. And it takes careful training to learn to see the fiction of empire. It's terribly inconvenient. And if this feels scary or new to you, hang in there. It gets better and worse, but mostly better. And remember what Walter said. The church meets to imagine what our lives can be like if the gospel were true. We meet to lament the failure of the totalism, to receive a new imagination for a world of neighboring, and to put our foot in the water together, just one foot. And I think if Walter were here today, he would say, keep going, Redemption Church. Don't give up. You're doing it. And the future of the people of God, and indeed our whole society, depends on our courage to put one foot in the water. And so I commend to you today a great friend of Redemption Church, St. Walter Brueggemann. May his memory be a blessing. Amen? Let's pray. Oh God, we do thank you for the life of Walter Brueggemann, his faithfulness, his brilliant mind, but mostly his just playful imagination, his courage to read the Bible and not force it into a mold, but to let it speak. And oh, how it speaks through his writing, his speaking, his work. We are so grateful and pray that his work will continue to bear fruit in the life of Redemption Church. Amen. If you would stand, please.